Very little pre-marriage counseling prepares couples for the possibility of mismatched libidos when it comes to sex. How can couples recover from this?
I so appreciate this question because typically what the research shows is that like 80% of men have higher libidos and 20% of women have higher libidos, right? So if you do that math, it pretty much means that like every single marriage is going to, at least a very high percentage of marriages are going to have mismatched libidos.
Oh, sorry, do you
Um,
mind clarifying what a libido is for anyone who may not
oh, yep,
know what that is?
of
Before we
course.
dive
Yeah.
in.
Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah.
Just that a libido is just like your sex drive. Like how often does that sound like a great idea to you? How often does your body tell you like, yes, I want to engage in that sexual touch, sexual release sounds like something I want right now,
Okay. Okay.
basically. So libido is that thing inside of your body that's saying, yes, sex sounds like a great idea.
No, that was a great
Yeah.
summary.
Yeah. And it's so normal. Like I think every single couple that I've ever worked with has said that they have different levels of sexual desire in their marriage. And so I think it's a great thing to start the conversation around, like what does that look like? What is the like desire for that? Like some men might say, I would love to have sex every day. That sounds great. And some men might say, nope, I'm good, like once a week, like that's fine. And again, it kind of comes back to that idea of communication. Like what is the desire that's there? What is like if you could paint an ideal picture of what that looks like, what does that look like for a couple? And I do think it's important to, like, I love the pre-marriage counseling piece. So important to have that conversation with someone if you're engaged, of kind of what does the sexual relationship look like? Do you have any expectations around that? What are those expectations? And what's a place where you guys can meet in the middle and stay connected? Um, Typically, if I'm working with couples who have mismatched libidos, my encouragement is to stay connected physically, even if it's not intercourse, right?
Okay.
That I think sometimes we can tie all physical touch with intercourse sometimes if we do have mismatched libidos, because then all touch for the person with lower sex drive, touch might be interpreted as like I expect intercourse, right? Like sometimes that can sound like, oh, if my husband's coming up to give me a hug, he's only showing me this affection because he's expecting sex later.
Mm,
And that we want to avoid that if at all possible,
yeah.
because typically that's not really what's going on, right? And so really, even if there's nights where one partner is like, hey, that sounds like fun, what are you doing later, like let's connect in that way, and the other partner's like, I am exhausted, I don't think he can meet you there, that's okay, but to still stay connected physically and maybe engage in some other physical activities. It's not intercourse, but that still feels connecting, that still feels safe, that what maybe you do have energy for, because really all that is a bid to feel close, a bid to feel connected. And so kind of still leaning into some activity, even if it's not intercourse, if that feels safe.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you obviously want to make sure maybe the person with the lower sex drive, the lower libido, is feeling safe and not just like driven to do all these things that maybe they're not comfortable with, or maybe they're just physically unable to do, like
Yeah.
tiredness or something. Yeah, I'm a mom, two young kids, you know,
It's
just
real.
being able like that energy, in the evening especially is really
Mhm.
low for me. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate though that you don't want to miss like maybe even what intercourse is really about. And it's really about connection. It's not just the act of sex, it's really about
Mhm.
two people coming together who love each other and just wanting to show that and just
Yeah.
trying to be creative in other ways, maybe so that the person with the higher libido can still feel that connection that they're seeking.
Yes.
And person with low libido can like kind of meet in that middle ground. So I really appreciate
Mhm.
that. And the question, they kind of mentioned that like very little pre-marriage counseling prepares that, like, if someone were in pre-marriage counseling, how do you prepare for that? Especially maybe if someone has never had sex before and maybe doesn't know? Like, what do you have any questions, or like how could someone even start to think about that before they marry someone?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Brittany. I think like there's a lot of really good books out there. Like Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts has kind of some guided questions in there for a couple that's looking towards marriage. But what I will say is kind of just like even starting the dialogue around sex. Like, what are you excited about? What are you looking forward to in that? Do you have any like nervousness or apprehension? Like, what do you think? What do you want that to look like now? Really? Because the idea with premarital counseling, at least in my brain, if two people have never had intercourse before and they're getting married, it's a little bit harder to have specific dialogue around that. But I think at least for me, my heart for a couple in that space is how can we just like open the door to that conversation so when you do get married, it doesn't feel uncomfortable to talk about it again,
Yeah,
right?
that makes
Like,
sense.
oh, hey, before we got married, we kind of talked about like maybe this was an ideal that we would connect sexually X amount of times a week. Now that we're married, we found like maybe that's a little bit different than we thought it was going to be, right? But we're just kind of like starting the conversation so that when you get married, it can be an ongoing conversation and you guys as a couple can iterate, right? What do we want this to look like? What does make sense for our lifestyle and our bodies? And now that we're noticing this and leaning into this part of our lives that feels kind of new, there's space, it's going to change.
Yeah.
You're going to learn about yourself in a very experiential way, right? It's just starting that conversation doesn't feel as uncomfortable to maybe start it later on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate just that it's a continuation. It doesn't necessarily mean like everything is planned out. This is the plan. We can't defer from the plan, but
Exactly.
at least it's started. So I think even go back to our other question, we don't want to let the sex area of our lives become this like awkward, like
Mhm.
tensiony area. It should be like a fluid conversation. Like, how am I feeling? How is their sex life? It's just part of who we are in a relationship. So.
Exactly.
Um,
Mhm.
so when you were answering that question too, I just thought of, I feel like, well, I don't know, it's, just talking to people maybe who haven't had sex before and they're getting married. Do you feel like a lot of people have like expectations of like what's a good sex life for how many times they have it, like type of thing? Like that's a good libido, that's a bad libido or anything?
I think some people do kind of carry that type of a mentality for one reason or another. Um, like I that's so common. Like people are taught such interesting things about sex in the world,
Yeah.
right? Like I've heard some things like there's men have a 72-hour rule where if they don't have sex for 72 hours, then there's this like pressure that builds up and they have to release it and I remember I wasn't taught that, so that felt new to me. And my face did what your face is doing, Brittany. That's interesting. But some people are taught that there's like these different rules around a sexual relationship. And like, gosh, people are unique enough that I don't think that we need the rule book. There's not a hard and fast rule. If you're not having sex X amount of times a week, then you're doing it wrong. I think like kind of like you use the word fluidity, there is a fluidity in
Mm,
a couple's sexual relationship. There's going to be seasons where maybe like one or both people are really stressed out at work and that lowers libido for some people,
mm,
right? For women, being tired is a really big barrier to wanting to connect sexually. It's less of a barrier for men, kind of what the studies show, but for women, it is a really significant barrier. And so I think that the idea is just how do we still stay connected,
yeah.
even if intercourse is maybe hard to find, like what are those spaces where we can still feel connected in this? Physically, we're still on the same page. We're still present with each other. Because it's going to like shift and change in different seasons of life based on stress, based on kids, right? And so having that open dialogue between the two of you and just making sure that the two partners in the couple are saying where they're at and being honest with each other and really checking in of like, how is that for you? How are you doing? How is this going right now? Like, how are we doing? right? And having that openness. But to answer the question, no, I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule. I think if there's like we have sex once a year, like I would maybe be concerned about that. But other than that, I think kind of, for lack of a better word, within normal range, it really does depend on the couple.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that clarity. And I'm sure our viewers, you know, 'cause I think there is maybe even sometimes different church cultures. It's like, well, your marriage is good if it's on this level, and maybe not good if it's like over here, but just trying to normalize every couple's the uniqueness. I love that. Like every couple is unique, every season's unique. Like there's so many factors to come into that. We can't just like put rules on sex life for good and bad or whatever.